Kregon's Dark World presents The Colony, a twisted tale of ants and madness. Part 1. The awakening Will jolted awake, his heart pounding in his chest. He gasped for breath, feeling as if he was suffocating. His eyes snapped open, and he was immediately aware of something crawling on his skin. He tried to brush it off, but there were too many of them. As he looked down, he saw thousands of ants swarming over his body, crawling into his mouth and nose, and biting at his flesh. Will tried to scream, but the ants were too quick, too numerous. They covered him like a living blanket, biting and tearing at his skin. The pain was excruciating, and Will felt as if he was being ripped apart. He could feel the ants crawling into his ears, into his eyes, into his very soul. He was paralyzed, unable to move or even scream, as the ants continued their frenzied assault. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the ants began to move with a purpose. They swarmed over Will's body, tearing off chunks of flesh and carrying them away. He watched in horror as his body was dismembered piece by piece, leaving nothing but a bloody, mangled mess. But the ants weren't done yet. They began to use the pieces of Will's body to construct a miniature house, building walls and floors with his skin and bones, using his blood as mortar. Will watched in disbelief as the ants created a perfect replica of his own home, down to the smallest detail. As the sun began to rise, the ants disappeared, leaving behind the twisted monument they had created. Will was left alone, his mind reeling with the horror of what he had witnessed. He tried to dismiss it all as a nightmare, but the memory of the ants crawling over his body lingered like a bad taste in his mouth. In the days that followed, Will noticed strange occurrences around his home. The ants continued to appear in strange places, crawling out of his sink and toilet, and even appearing in his bed. Will tried to ignore them, but they seemed to be following him, haunting him like a bad omen. Desperate for answers, Will began to research the behavior of ants, reading everything he could find on the subject. He learned that ants were capable of incredible feats of strength and coordination, and that they had a complex social hierarchy. But nothing he read could explain what had happened to him that night. The ants continued to torment Will, crawling over him at night and biting at his flesh. He tried to fight them off, but they seemed to be immune to his efforts. It was then that he realized that the ants weren't just random creatures. They were trying to tell him something, using his own body as a canvas. As Will delved deeper into the mystery, he began to uncover clues that suggested a sinister force was at work. He found strange symbols etched into the walls of his home, and he began to hear strange whispers in the dead of night. Something was coming, something dark and malevolent that was using the ants as its minions. Will knew that he was running out of time. He had to find out the truth behind the ants before it was too late. But as he delved deeper into the mystery, he realized that the truth was far more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. Part 2. The Reckoning. As the ants continued to swarm around him, Will began to feel as if he was losing his mind. He had tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening to him, but there was none to be found. The ants were in control, and he was powerless to stop them. One night, as Will lay in bed, covered in ants, he felt a sudden pain in his chest. It was as if something was trying to claw its way out of his body. He screamed in agony, but no one came to his rescue. As the pain intensified, Will felt himself slipping away. His body began to contort and twist, as if being reshaped from the inside out. He watched in horror as his limbs grew longer and thinner, his skin turning a sickly shade of green. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pain stopped. Will looked down at his new body, a body that was no longer human. He had become an ant, a part of the swarm that had haunted him for so long. As he crawled out of bed and joined his new family, Will realized that he had a newfound power. He could communicate with the ants, understand their thoughts and desires. The swarm was in chaos. A new queen had taken control, and she was hungry for power. She had grown tired of the humans encroaching on their territory, destroying their homes and their families. Will, now one with the swarm, knew that he had to take action. He led the swarm on a rampage through the city, tearing apart buildings and devouring anything in their path. The humans were powerless against the army of ants, their weapons useless against the sheer force of their numbers. As the swarm grew larger and more powerful, Will realized that he was no longer in control. The queen had taken over, her thirst for power driving her to new heights of brutality. And then, one day, it was over. The swarm disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind a city in ruins and a population decimated. Will, now returned to his human form, was the only survivor. He had watched in horror as the swarm devoured his friends and family, leaving nothing but a trail of destruction in their wake. As he stood in the ruins of his former life, Will knew that he had been forever changed. He could still hear the whispers of the ants, the echoes of their thoughts and desires. It was a hell of a dark world when the ants took over, he thought to himself, and he knew that he would never be the same. The end. Or is it? Hey there, fellow sickos. It's Kregon, your friendly neighborhood purveyor of twisted tales and dark horrors. And today, I've got a story that will make you want to squirm in your seat and check under your bed for creepy crawlies. Inspired by a comment from one of our own, Will_man on YouTube, I present to you The Colony, a twisted tale of ants and madness. It's a story that will leave you questioning your own sanity and wondering what really goes on in the dark corners of your mind. And speaking of dark corners, have you ever noticed how YouTube's algorithm seems to lead you down a rabbit hole of disturbing content? It's like the algorithm has a sick sense of humor, just like me. But enough about YouTube. Let's talk about The Colony. This story is not for the faint of heart. It's a brutal, gory, and mind-bending journey into the world of ants and the madness that can ensue when you mess with them. So, if you're a fan of dark humor, twisted tales, and being creeped out beyond belief, then hit that like and subscribe button. You won't regret it, or maybe you will. But either way, it's a hell of a dark world out there, and I'm here to bring you the most twisted stories imaginable.